In recent history, the UK has been home to several political parties, on the left of the Labour Party and the Greens, toward the right of the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, along with the far-right populist parties such as the BNP, EDL or National Front. The UK was uniquely positioned within the EU, but also very closely allied to the USA, until it recently left the EU for reasons no one really understands. The Church, historically at least, played a very large part in the UK's politics, and began to clash with the nascent gay rights movement in the 60s and 70s. Let's take a closer look at the political support for the gay rights movement in the UK. The gay rights movement was set up to seek equality for lesbians, gays and bisexuals, which became known more recently as the LGB community. This movement grew to include the transsexual community, people who physically transition from male to female or vice versa. It was supported by the Labour Party and to a lesser extent the Lib Dems, while the Conservative Party were in opposition to it, especially during the 1980s under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher. Also opposed were the Church and the far-right groups such as the BNP, and more recently by elements of the alt-right. Meanwhile, the Green Party wasn't really involved because they were off looking at trees and being naked in fields. That has all changed in recent times, however, and the Conservatives and Greens, along with most of the country, rightly support LGB rights. In fact, the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition were the ones to legalise gay marriage, a decision that even saw the Church reluctantly show their support. So, all was well, the people were happy, and only the far right had an issue. The battle had been won to a large extent and everything seemed stable. However, a new ideology wormed its way over and got involved. This came from America and was called queer theory. All you need to know for this video is that queer theory brought along identity politics and the concept of transgenderism, and all hell has broken loose ever since. Let's take a quick look at transgenderism. Under the umbrella of the term transgender or trans, there are many other groups of people who identify as non-binary, asexual, pangender, queer gender, and gender fluid. These are just the main most referenced groups, however, as trans includes an almost unlimited amount of gender identities within it, including neurogender, vapogender, and tetrasgender, which is honestly not a joke. There are far too many to include all of them here now. Queer theory has also opened up the term trans to crossdressers and drag artists, autogynephilic or AGP men, heterosexual men who are sexually aroused at the idea of having a female body. Queer theory takes this further by adding transhumanists into the mix too, including furries, rubber pups, and other fetish communities, all under the umbrella of trans. Finally, people called intersex, or suffering from disorders of sexual development, have also been included under this banner, despite many of them not wanting to change their sex. This means that the previously sexuality-based LGBT rights movement has now become the gender-based LGBTQIA+ movement, entirely due to queer theory and the transgender movement that grew in American social studies courses, spread online primarily through Tumblr, and is heavily supported by groups and people such as Susie Green and Mermaids, the gay rights campaigner Peter Tatchell, Ruth Hunt at Stonewall, Benjamin Cohen at Pink News, Owen Jones and others at The Guardian, and Ash Sarkar and Aram Bastani at Novara Media. So now the debate has shifted, it's no longer about gay, lesbian or bisexual rights, it's more of a political movement aligned with queer theory, which has become known as gender ideology. The gender ideology movement has looked to promote transgender rights online using social media, and has seen the creation of the trans rights activists, or TRAs. The very first thing these fundamental activists did was to bully the transsexual community out of their ideology, labelling them true scum for having undergone cross-sex surgery. Trans rights activists popularised the phrase "trans women are women," changing the meaning from an initially figurative slogan designed to attract support for trans rights to a now literal belief that trans women are in fact biologically women. We'll look at this later on in our video. Needless to say, feminists weren't best pleased when they saw this autogynephilic men who were sexually aroused by the idea they have a female body, were now claiming access to women-only safe spaces, such as rape crisis shelters or communal changing rooms. Feminists and feminist groups opposing this were attacked by trans rights activists labelled TERFs, or trans exclusionary radical feminists. Nothing perhaps demonstrates the move from a sexuality-based movement to a gender-based movement more than the splitting of feminist lesbians from the LGBTQIA+ movement, who joined with transsexuals and other allies to create the gender-critical movement. A lot of this was in response to heterosexual autogynephilic men claiming to be lesbian women, despite not changing their sex in any other way than wearing women's clothing. The gender-critical movement was attacked by very abusive trans rights activists and also anti-feminist groups such as the men's rights movement, along with other misogynistic trolls on media such as Reddit, 4chan and Twitter. At the same time, these trolls were also joined by the police, who received training from such gender ideology groups as Stonewall and Mermaids. In more recent times, large parts of the intersex community have left the LGBTQIA+ movement, unhappy that their disorders in sexual development are being appropriated and misrepresented to suggest there is a scientific basis for transgenderism. In fact, most of the scientific community is now squarely in the gender-critical camp, as the denial of biology by the trans rights activists is pushed forward ever more frequently. Finally, the gender-critical movement has seen a rise in detransitioners joining, many of whom have been almost excommunicated from the transgender community and received abuse rather than support from trans rights activists once they decided to revert back to their original gender. So, in summary, that's how the gender-critical side began, as a pushback to the often violent and abusive trans rights activists.
You transphobic piece of shit.
So this is the protesters who have a right to protest but not to intimidate. They're kicking on the windows to stop the meeting. The police are doing nothing. They're just standing there and letting people kick the window. Police are doing nothing. Police are still doing nothing. So intimidation of women is continuing. Police are doing nothing.
Our experience made us realise actually how bad the state of women's
I'm getting fed up with this, you know. I've had things thrown at me. I've been accused of things I have never done or said. People seem to have no concern about evidence or indeed even about libel.
If a man has his gender reassigned and outwardly and he feels inwardly is a woman, in your view, can he be a woman or not?
No.
There are two genders, male and female. Sometimes you're not lucky enough to be born into the right one, so you transition into the one that you suit the most.
Which seems to me eminently sensible, and I have complete respect for people that do that. It's not an easy process, physically, psychologically, emotionally, or any of those things. I salute you for your common sense. Now, let's bring you into this equation. There are 100 different genders on this BBC list, apparently, right? One of them is two-spirit person, polygender, pangender, neutroids, intergender.
I have to say,
do you know what they mean?
I have no idea what they mean.
There are 100 genders they can identify as. You have come to defend it, and you don't know what half of these are.
But hang on, Piers, ignorance isn't a defence.
You're the ignorant one, and you're the one defending it. What this does is actually makes, I think, people who have transgendered, it makes them figures of fun. It exposes them to needless mockery. It makes the whole thing look ridiculous.
Only if you mock.
And actually, the real victims tend to be people who have transgendered and have to put up with this nonsense. How many sexualities do you think there are?
Oh, well, don't ask me to...
Transphobic piece of shit! Transphobic piece of shit!
Male trans activist decided to pummel a grandmother because she wanted to attend a talk about whether or not the Conservative proposal to change the Gender Recognition Act so that you don't have to be a transsexual anymore to be able to change your legal gender is a good idea. Miranda Yardley, who was scheduled to speak at this event.
You're doing this to a transsexual. You're doing this to a transsexual. That is amazing. You're silencing a transsexual.
I'm not silencing you.
Transmisogyny is a made-up word.
I'd like to begin by saying I think it's really ironic that the first act that this committee, which calls itself the Women and Equalities Committee, the first report that they publish is something that actually is thoroughly antithetical to women's rights. And and the voices of women and women's organisations seem to have been very much ignored in the production of this report.
Trying to intimidate and threaten venues where these kind of events are scheduled and trying to get them to shut down the events. This was no exception. They actually had to change to a secret location, which is why they were meeting at Speaker's Corner instead of the actual original venue, which was forced to cancel after safety concerns. The safety concerns being the threats made to them by trans activists.
I have never seen an issue become so central so quickly as the whole trans debate. It really has sprung up from almost nowhere in a couple of years, actually. And now what's happened is that various women who are now here called trans-exclusionary radical feminists, even if they're just actually kind of fairly normal women with no major political stance, are saying, you know what, we're not entirely comfortable with this idea, which has been put forward by Maria Miller, actually.
Maria Miller's a Tory MP who's never done anything for women. She's very, very conservative. So it's not really a surprise to me that she and the Tory party are pushing this legislation change because it is very regressive. So here they all are at Speaker's Corner chanting at the scary lesbians who've assembled so that they can go and watch this talk. 60-year-old Maria Magdalen is filming the protesters, as you would in that sort of situation. This bloke runs out and tries to smack the camera out of her hand, but that doesn't work. She decides that she's going to film the guy, and then she gets descended on by two blokes who are trying to rip her camera out of her hand. At this point, even some of the trans activist allies are a bit concerned, and one young woman tries to get one of the trans activists off. He turns around and starts squaring up with her and threatening her. So that's where they finally got the camera. Meanwhile, trans activist bloke squaring up to his ally. The other one seems to think he's in a mosh pit. His mate attacks Maria, and then his other mate comes in from the right side to grab her as well, and she ends up on the floor.
Today, protesters, trans activists turned up demanding that Dr. Lawford-Smith be sacked, essentially for setting up a website where women can share their experiences of how women's only spaces have been impacted by trans activism and having male bodies in spaces like change rooms or women's shelters. And she's just set up a website seeking this data to see if it is having an impact, if it's not, what are women's experiences. And for that, she has become a target, even of fellow academics who have written this open letter against her and demanded the university take action against her. It is really quite ugly, and we've got some footage here of some of her supporters who also turned up at the protest, having water thrown on them, being intimidated and verbally abused. I don't know if we've got that footage to roll.
Yep, well, here we go.
So you can see there throwing water on one of her supporters there who's just standing there, and it got quite heated. Let's just have a quick listen to some of the rhetoric during this protest.
All of you off! Last year, you tripped me over like for 3 hours straight while your dead friend had a bottle of vinegar and water was spraying me in the eyes while a bunch of were doing nothing about it. Are you happy about yourself?
Hey, can we please de-escalate this? It is important.
Can we get these turfs off this campus?
I think misogyny plays a really big part in all of this. That a man who goes to these lengths will be a better woman than someone who was just born a woman.